Hello, everyone. Today it's May the 3rd, and we have the INTS 499 senior assignment presentations from 1 o'clock to 3:30 today. And today we'll be listening to seniors Madison Hughes, Peter Dimitrov, Ashley Brown, and Blair Tabelluli with their presentations for the final projects, final assignments. So Madison Hughes will talk about the importance of preserving Native American culture and what can be done to preserve it. Peter Dimitrov will talk about sustaining the regime, the consequences of war on the Syrian economy. Ashley Brown will talk about crisis communication practices of international organizations, and Blair Tabelluli will talk about creating sustainable communities guidebook. The rule for presentations today is that you have each of you 30 minutes, but please allow around 25 minutes for your presentations and 5 minutes for questions and answers. And if we don't have anybody else from the public, virtual public, please don't hesitate to ask each other questions. So first, Madison Hughes with the importance of preserving Native American culture and what can be done to preserve it. Take it away, and you can also share your screen.
Okay, let me share. Okay. So my name is Madison. I'm going to be presenting on the importance of Native American culture and what we can do to preserve it. So I'm going to be looking at the Cherokee and Zapotec tribes, and we're going to look at their backgrounds and where they kind of came from and originated. And then we're going to look at the languages they speak, as well as their spiritual beliefs. And then to wrap it up, we're going to talk about some useful information about how you can preserve, how we can preserve their culture, and just steps that are being taken already to preserve those cultures. So the Cherokee tribe is a North American tribe. They're a group of Indians that derive from the Iroquoian lineage, and their name is derived from the Creek language and means people of different speech. They are also referred to as the Kituwa and Slagi. In 1650, they were believed to have been about 22,500 individuals in the tribe. They used to control about 40,000 square miles of land in the Appalachian Mountains. The area that they occupied is now parts of Georgia, Eastern Tennessee, as well as western parts of North and South Carolina. They are constituted as the largest politically integrated tribes during the time of European colonization of the Americas. Their lives consisted of traditions that were taken from Greek people, as well as other tribes of the Southeast region. They were encountered by Spanish explorers in the 16th century, and when they found them, they had seen that they already had tools such as knives, axes, and chisels, and they had figured out how to weave baskets, make pottery, cultivate corn, beans, and squash. Their villages were about 30 to 60 houses, as well as a council house where they had general meetings and a sacred fire that always burned. Their houses were windowless log cabins with bark roofs that had one door and a hole in the ceiling for smoke ventilation. And then the Spanish, French, and English all had made attempts on colonizing the Cherokees in the 18th century, but the tribe made an alliance with the British for trading and military purposes. So now we're going to talk about the Zapotec. They are also known as Cloud People, who originated in Mesoamerica. They're from the Valley of Oaxaca, where they lived from the pre-classical period up to the classical period, which is 500 BCE to 900 CE. they were able to build up their agricultural community during that time and make a connection with the Olmec civilization. And they did that by becoming trading partners with them. And that was along the Gulf Coast where they were able to build up their capital, Monte Alban, and they were able to dominate that region during the time. So as I just mentioned, Monte Alban was their capital city. Around 500 BCE, the city evolved over the next few centuries and remained the cultural center until about 900 CE at the demise of the civilization. In the surrounding valleys, there were over 15 elite palaces. They were also separated into 3 distinct groups: the Valley Zapotec, the Sierra Zapotec, and the Southern Zapotec. 12 of their major sites were spread across the Valley of Oaxaca, and they were Monte Alban, Oaxaca, Huitzo, Etla, San Jose, Magoda, Tachila, Zimatlan, Octalan, Abasolo, Tlaclua, and Mitla. Mitla became a very important city to the Zapotec in 900 CE. And it was known for the arrangement of its buildings and geometrical decorative designs. And over the years, these cities grew to become very sophisticated as they had beautiful architecture, art, writing, and engineering projects, such as creating an irrigation system. And I just forgot to switch my slides, so sorry about that. Okay, so this is the tribe's locations. You can see that Oaxaca is towards the bottom of Mexico, and you can see where the Cherokee and how was living in the United States, in the states that I was kind of talking about that they lived in. So now we're going to talk about their languages. So the Cherokee language is derived from Iroquoian language. It's thought that the Cherokee migrated from the Great Lakes because of the fact that the people were Iroquoian speakers. The Cherokee writing system was developed by Sequoia, who supposedly had little English knowledge. And although he didn't know very much English, he invented the writing system by adding a mystique to his initial accomplishments. So the Zapotec language, there's about 58 that are part of the Ottoman linguistic stock, and they've spoken it for thousands of years. And there's many groups among it too. The first being the Northern Zapotec. This is spoken in the northern mountainous region of Oaxaca. The next is the Valley of Zapotec, which is spoken in the mountain ranges, the Southern Sierra Madre of Oaxaca. And finally is the Isthmus Zapotec. This is spoken in the Isthmus of Ehantec. And then, so since these tribes have kind of started to die out over the years, the languages have started to go with them. There's only about 2,000 people that are speaking the Cherokee language today. Most of those people are over 50, and hardly any speakers are in their 30s or 40s, and there's virtually no one below the age of 20 that speaks it. Preserving languages like this is very important for many reasons, such as to continue spreading knowledge and traditions from the culture. The language has been around for more than 11,000 years, and seeing it die out is very upsetting to people who do still speak it and want to keep their culture alive. And then, so about 450,000 people speak a Zapotec language in the Mexican states of Oaxaca and Veracruz. Of the 58 different Zapotec languages, 49 of them have less than 10,000 speakers. Those languages have only a couple hundred or a few thousand that speak them consistently, so they're beginning to die out. In Zapotec towns that are still around, most of the children are not being taught their native language. They're being taught Spanish primarily, as well as English. So now we're going to talk about some of their spiritual beliefs. So the Cherokee look up to the upper world for guidance and protection to help balance and to help keep balance and harmony on Earth. They want to keep that balance by doing daily prayers and rituals, as well as seasonal ceremonies. A common ritual that they would perform is called going to water. So this would be performed when there was a new moon, before special dances, after bad dreams, or if someone was ill. So what they would do is men and women and children would face the east and dip under the water 7 times. They believed that this would cleanse their spirit and body and get rid of bad feelings, making them ready to start anew. Religion of Europeans was much different than the Cherokee. So when the Europeans encountered the Cherokee, they were both surprised by how each other thought of their religious beliefs. So some of the Cherokee accepted like the Christianity, and they were eager to learn about it because they also wanted to learn English, and they also wanted to understand like the white man's world. And so the Zapotec practiced religion like most other Mesoamericans, such as having important deities that they would pray to, asking for things regarding rain, earth, sun, wind, and war. Some of the most important gods were Bat God, which was the god of corn and fertility, Beto, god of wind and seeds, Kogio, which is pictured on the slide, was the god of rain and lightning. And then Pixie Picala was the god of love. And those are just a few. They have very many that they worship. So there were some individual cities that had their own sacred deities, and people would offer prayers and sacrifices for them in hopes of their favorable intervention, such as asking them for rain to help like flourish their crops or to end a drought. Okay, so to preserve these cultures, you could support preservation foundations, such as the Cherokee Preservation Foundation, which helps tribal members live, share, and preserve the Cherokee culture. The Zapotec Language Project is run by the University of California, Santa Cruz, and members of the Zapotec language community in an effort to preserve and strengthen the languages. On their website, they have a dictionary and text written in the language that you can go through, and you can kind of teach yourself a few words or some phrases. And then the Dwight Mission, in June of 2014, the Cherokee Nation donated $120,000 to preserve a former 3-story school that was originally built in Arkansas. The building now serves as a retreat and conference center. And then the Slagi Sunadella Plasti was a school that was founded in 2001 in Oklahoma, and it's the first Cherokee language immersion school, and it now teaches nearly 100 K through sixth graders, and it's working to preserve what's left of the Cherokee culture as well as teaching those kids the language. So having more immersion schools like that, I think would help preserve if people like people of Cherokee descent wanted to send like their children to immerse them into the culture. And then to preserve Zapotec culture, for a man, Porfirio Gutierrez, was bringing together a group of experts as well as anyone that was interested to attend a workshop on how traditional dyes were made for basket weaving. The National Museum of the American Indian agreed to help fund a 4-day workshop educating individuals on plants that they get the dyes from and how exactly they're made. And after the workshop, the museum made a video about it and the dye making process, and as well as offering a glimpse of life in Oaxaca. And those are the ways that we can help preserve these cultures. And I thank you all for listening to my presentation today.
Okay, thank you for your presentation. Do you have any questions, people in the audience?
I have a question.
Yep.
So, Madison, how did you get, what made you choose this topic and go like this route for your senior assignment?
So I was doing my study abroad and we had to give presentations on like global issues that were going on, and one of the girls in my class did a presentation on a tribe, I think in Europe, and how like they were living perfectly fine until they were like recently, like within the past like maybe 20 years, that they were still like living just perfectly fine. And then they were colonized and like brought a bunch of new technology and stuff. And it really made me think like about how we don't like preserve the culture of Native Americans here, and just like how much it is pushed back instead of like because like they were the first people here. So it's important to remember that.
Awesome, thank you.
I see that Peter has a question.
Yeah, I really liked your presentation. Very good job. It was a very interesting topic. I actually, when you pulled up the slide with the Cherokee alphabet, I thought it was interesting, so I pulled it up on my own computer. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of these symbols, the characters that they use, kind of have some similarities to characters in the Latin alphabet. And I was wondering, is this something like an effect that that happened after colonization of the New World, or is it just some sort of coincidence that a lot of these characters seem very similar to a lot of characters in like the Latin script?
I'm not 100% sure, but I'm guessing it might be because of the fact that like the guy who came up with the alphabet had like influence from English, and like the fact that in Europe Latin was like a really main language because of like the Catholic Church, and since they were Christians, I could see them like bringing that over, like the Latin with them, and Cherokee like being like seeing that as well. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it seems to me that these were interpretations of linguists that came from Europe much later, and tried to give an interpretation, a sound that was familiar to them for themselves to the sounds that the Zapotec or the Cherokees were using before. Because I don't know of any Native American tribes that really had a written language. I know only about pictograms, especially the Aztecs. That's how they kept their history with drawings and symbols that could be understood as a story, like in cartoons, continual sequences of events presented in cartoonish manner. So they were more like pictograms. But I was wondering, at a certain moment, you said that they spoke their language for the past 11,000 years. How could they really pinpoint that they were speaking 11,000 years ago the same language?
I'm not too sure. It might be like, yeah, I'm not, I'm not too sure about that. I didn't really find that in the research, like how
Right.
they did that. Yeah.
Right. Maybe that sends more to, the first archaeological remains that they could find
Yeah.
about those people, but not necessarily something about how they spoke the language. Because I have been in North Dakota, and they have museums of old deer skins that they were wearing or they were used on their teepees. And usually they would draw this kind of history to tell the stories from one generation to another. They were keeping their history on something like that, on deer skins. But these are inherently materials that cannot be preserved a very long time. Okay, anybody else that has any other questions for medicine? Well, it seems to me that it's interesting that there are some signs of reviving these old cultures, at least some feeble attempts. You mentioned 100 K through 6 graders learning the language. Yeah, well, I guess at least if they preserve the stories from such First Nations, that would be interesting. I read at a certain moment some writings from different Native American tribes in the United States. Okay, so if we don't have any other questions, going once, going twice, we'll move on to Peter Dimitrov, and he will tell us all about his presentation. So, Peter, you can take over the screen.
Yes, I just want to mention that when I joined this Zoom call, I was having some internet issues. I restarted my router and everything, so for now it seems to be okay. But if I start cutting out, I'm sorry, it might happen. Anyways. Okay.
Oh, so you are on a phone?
Oh yeah, I'm very sorry. I don't have a microphone on my desktop or a camera for that matter. So
okay.
I
now that you put it like this, I think we can see it better.
Okay, yeah. Anyways, so my name is. Is my camera still on? By the way, can you actually see my face?
No.
No. Here, I wonder if there's a way to. Oh, sorry. Should I try to put my camera on? Or is it okay?
If you know how to do it. If not, let's watch the presentation and we can hear your voice.
Okay. All right. So yeah, my name is Peter Dimitrov, and today I'll be presenting my project on the consequences of war on the Syrian economy. So the Syrian civil war is a conflict that broke out in 2011. It is currently ongoing, and since its beginning, it has taken the lives of more than 350,000 people. And unfortunately, many of them have been civilians. So the subject matter of this presentation is very heavy, and although nothing particularly gruesome or grotesque is mentioned or said or depicted, I just want to warn the audience that the subject is very intense. So to broadly outline the goals of this project, I wanted to see how the Assad regime that has controlled Syria throughout the conflict has sustained itself, how it's maintained its power, because even the most powerful countries could easily fall over the course of a 10-year-long internal conflict. And so it is genuinely almost impressive that the Assad regime has been able to maintain its power in Syria throughout this prolonged conflict. And so my goal here is to analyze how exactly they have managed economically during that period, and essentially what the Assad regime has done to sustain itself. So going back to the Cold War, when the United States and the Soviet Union are both in a race for geopolitical influence, and the Iron Curtain in Europe has already been drawn, and there is a clear boundary between the Western powers and the Soviet bloc, which cannot be crossed by any means at risk of causing a nuclear war to break out. The Soviet Union turns its attention to other regions of the world, including the Middle East. And that is where its relations with Syria start building. So in this map that you can see on the slide here, we can see the distribution of Soviet foreign aid between 1954 and 1984. So as we can see, Syria is one of the countries that received a significant amount of foreign aid from the Soviet Union, and that can easily indicate to us that relations between them were warm. And in turn, Syria also sought to cater to Soviet interests. In 1961, a national decree was passed which would nationalize some of Syria's largest industries and the banking sector. And this decision by no means was met with universal praise. In fact, there were surely many shareholders and business owners within Syria who definitely did not like the idea of having their assets seized by the government. But the legislation was justified with the words that it was meant to transform workers into owners, do away with class distinction, and eliminate social barriers. So this rhetoric is very Marxist in its nature, which is obviously akin to the sort of policy positions that you might see from the Soviet Union at the time. And so it seems that the passing of this legislation by no means can be considered just a mere coincidence, but rather it has something to do with what we discussed on the previous slide, which is that Syria received significant amounts of foreign aid from the Soviet Union, and of course they would want to maintain good relations with this ally of theirs, being one of the strongest powers on the international stage. And so, to those ends, Syria passed such legislation in order to closer align themselves with the Soviet Union in terms of policy. With the dissolution of the Soviet Union, however, Syria found itself in a 10-year period of relative economic isolation from the rest of the world. They had just lost their strongest ally and one of their largest trading partners. And so also the newly established Russian Federation maintained cool relations with a lot of the former Soviet allies. Which lasted until the election of President Vladimir Putin. Now, Putin sought to restore some of the geopolitical influence that the Soviet Union had lost with its dissolution back in the 90s. So to those ends, he rekindled diplomacy with Syria. And as we can see in this map of the distribution of foreign aid from Russia between 2011 and 2015, Syria is even more heavily emphasized here than it was in the previous map, which depicted the foreign aid from the Soviet Union. So this tells us that clearly Putin supports the Syrian government, and that has ended up definitely being the case over the course of the war. Putin's government has not only supported the Assad regime financially, but also militarily. And this map, by the way, is exactly from the period following the beginning of the Syrian civil war, which would obviously be the period when Syria would need the most foreign aid. So the actual causes of the Syrian civil war are multiple, but if we had to boil them down to a few essential elements, first of all, we have the state corruption. So this is something that we'll discuss in further detail later on in the presentation. But suffice it to say for now that the Syrian government is very corrupt, and they have been known to essentially just take advantage of their people in order for monetary gain and just having power within the context of their country. Political leaders have been known to appropriate funds intended for state projects and all sorts of stuff like that. And so economic opportunity in Syria in 2011 was not very good. Essentially, there weren't a lot of ways to get out of poverty if you were just an average citizen, which obviously would have caused a lot of discontent. Also, it is important to note here that the Assad dynasty at this point had been in control of Syria for over 40 years. So it is easiest to explain this in the sense that the Syrian people were just fed up with the inefficient governance that they had received over the course of the past 40 years. And as the Arab Spring protests swept across northern Africa and the Middle East, Syria quickly followed suit. When a demonstration in the city of Dera turned violent in 2011, with law enforcement actually murdering numerous protesters, this was a spark that ignited protests to spread across the country. And these protests turned increasingly violent each day. The protesters started arming themselves in order to defend from government forces. And eventually, the conflict escalated into a full-on civil war. So unfortunately, the Syrian civil war is not quite as simple as the government forces and the anti-government forces. Rather, there are multiple factions that all have their own agendas and their own interests that fight within Syria. So this map here depicts 4 separate factions. So we have the Kurds to the north. So the Kurdish people are an ethnic minority group in the region without their own state. And so they oppose the Assad government in the hope that by toppling it, they can receive some sort of autonomy and perhaps even establish their own state to the north. Then we have the Islamic State, which would be ISIS, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They have also taken control of significant swaths of Syrian territory over the course of the war. They are essentially Islamic fundamentalists and radicals, and their ideology really does put them in opposition to most, pretty much everybody else who is involved in the conflict. And so ISIS can be considered somewhat of an independent variable in the Syrian civil war, but an important one nonetheless. And then we have the opposition forces, which would just be the armed forces that are standing up to the Assad regime in an attempt to overthrow it. And then we have the Syrian armed forces, which would be the forces of the Assad regime, which are
Oops, Peter. Hello. It seems that my connection dropped. It's not good.
very little control. And this has devastating economic consequences. The most obvious reason would obviously be that the Syrian government no longer has access to the resources or the infrastructure within those regions that are now occupied by other factions. But additionally, this territorial fragmentation also poses a logistical problem for Syria because it disrupts trade routes. So essentially, as one may imagine, any overland transport that might be going between Syria and Turkey through that northern section of the country, that would be essentially either impossible or very dangerous at the very least. There is obviously a risk of interference and interception from the occupying forces. And so either these shipments are simply not delivered, or alternatively, they would have to be redirected to pass through safer territory, which on its own also can add additional costs to the goods that are being transferred. So yeah, this just the territorial fragmentation of Syria causes a lot of compounding economic problems, which cannot be extensively discussed in this presentation. But suffice it to say that it has been very negative in its impact to Syria's economy. So on top of the various factions that fight for influence within Syria, there are also international interests in this conflict as well. And as we discussed already, Russia clearly does have an interest in defending the Assad regime in this conflict. In this, they are joined by Iran, another state actor, very much closer to Syria, who also support the Assad regime and their war efforts. And then, as you can see on this diagram here at the bottom right corner, it is depicted that an organization called Hezbollah is also on the side of the Assad government. They are a faction that we will discuss further a bit later in the presentation. But I did want to draw some attention to it. And then on the opposite side, we have the interests of the United States and their coalition, and the Arab Gulf states, which would be Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. So the reason for U.S. involvement and interest in this conflict broadly can be chalked up to two main factors. First of all, we have the war on terror. So the war on terror is the stance of the U.S. government to oppose Islamic radicalism in the Middle East. And this is a consequence of the 9/11 terror attacks in New York City in 2001. So when the United States see that ISIS is beginning to take control over significant portions of Syrian territory after the beginning of the war, they perceive it as a growing threat in the region. And so they see fit to conduct bombing runs over ISIS-controlled territory. However, one of my sources indicated that even though the U.S. military conducted military actions against ISIS, they did so strategically in a way that would avoid in any way benefiting Assad's forces. So essentially, since both the U.S. and the Syrian government are opposed to ISIS, the U.S. had to carefully coordinate their attacks on ISIS in such a way that by attacking ISIS, they would not also be assisting the Assad government in any significant way. So with all of these external state actors taking an interest and interfering in the Syrian civil war in both direct and indirect ways, we can clearly see that this conflict has evolved into much more than simply a civil war. It has become more of a proxy war between the interests of the United States and Russia. So this definitely does put Syria in a very difficult position because it becomes a battleground not only for the factions that are within it, but also a battleground on the international stage. So next, I want to address some of the aforementioned corruption on the part of the Assad government. So the Assad regime started in the early 1970s when the current president's father, Hafez al-Assad, took power. Shortly after he came to power, in 1973, he ratified a new constitution for Syria. Under this constitution, there was severe repression of civil liberties such as freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and things like that, but also it assigned all positions of political power to members of his very own party. And so this obviously creates the perfect conditions for state corruption to fester, because when you only have one option on the ballot, how can you really represent the public opinion and public interest? Well, it essentially becomes impossible. And so I really like this quote from the journal Middle East Quarterly. It is very eloquent in its description of the Syrian political system after a decade of Assad rule. By the beginning of the 1980s, the desire for financial benefit and political advantage had supplanted ideology as the main reason for Syrians to join the ruling Ba'ath Party. Now, this is to say that rather than any sort of ideological commitment, any attempts to better the conditions within the country, pretty much all politicians following going forward from 1980 only joined Syrian politics with the goal of furthering their own economic and political interest, rather than any sort of consideration for the people of the country. Now, additionally, there are multiple corruption scandals that involve either government officials or direct members of the Assad family that have taken place in Syria. For example, there was an instance where a relative of Assad was directly implicated in conspiring with a business in order to have it monopolize in its industry. And there are just multiple examples of these sort of scandals that have taken place since 1970. However, we do not have enough time in this presentation to cover even a fraction of them. So suffice it to say that government corruption in Syria was rampant, and it was essentially built into the way that the government system was structured. There's almost no way to avoid it, essentially. So this brings us to our next topic. Now we will discuss the trade of Captagon in the Middle East. So for those of you who may not know, Captagon is an amphetamine-based drug, which is widely unheard of in the Western world, but in the Middle East, it is a very in-demand narcotic. Essentially, the production of this drug before the breakout of the Syrian civil war took place in Lebanon's Bekaa Valley. And these drug manufacturing operations were largely conducted by another Islamic fundamentalist group originating from Lebanon called Hezbollah, which brings us back to the graphic we saw earlier. So Hezbollah had established all of these drug production operations within the territory of Lebanon, and it was a fairly profitable trade. Most of the buyers of Captagon were actually the Arab Gulf states of Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And so it was not a very large distance away from Lebanon, and it was just a very lucrative form of profit for Hezbollah. However, towards the beginning of the Syrian civil war, the Lebanese government actually began to crack down on these drug operations within their territory. And as the conflict in Syria was just ramping up, Hezbollah saw the perfect opportunity to relocate their operations right across the border into Syria. So in Syria, with a civil war happening, they did not have to worry as much about government interference with their operations, and smuggling becomes much easier when you're doing it through a conflict zone rather than a state with proper law enforcement. So many of the drug production, much of the drug production by Hezbollah was relocated across the Syrian border, and there have also been indications that the Syrian government actually has a mutually beneficial agreement with these drug lords that occupy its territory. Essentially, sources suggest that the Assad government has been renting out territory to Hezbollah drug operations in order to make a profit of this lucrative trade. And this would in some ways make sense because a large part of Syria's economy during the war was entirely dependent on foreign aid received from its allies in Russia and Iran. And these funds were oftentimes not enough, or definitely not consistent enough to maintain the regime. So profiting from the drug trade, on the other hand, would provide a much more consistent source of revenue for the Assad government. And this is only further supported when we take a look at this map and we see where the major Captagon production facilities are situated within Syria. As we can see in this map, almost all of them are within regime-controlled territory. So the scenario outlined before of there being direct cooperation between the Assad government and the Hezbollah drug runners seems to be substantiated significantly by this photo. So where does this leave Syria today? Well, although the conflict is still technically ongoing and the fighting in Syria has not stopped, the threat to Assad's power has essentially been stamped out at this point. There is no significant internal threat to Assad's government's control over Syria, and that leaves it actually in a fairly bad position when it comes to any reconstruction efforts. So the main issues that are facing Syrian reconstruction right now is the government corruption. Essentially, very few Western powers are willing to provide aid to reconstruct Syria, given that they would essentially be funding the Assad regime by doing so. And additionally, even if they were willing to provide the aid that would be necessary to reconstruct Syria, with the Assad regime in power, there is a very high likelihood that a lot of this funding that would supposedly be invested into the reconstruction of infrastructure and the economy would actually instead just be appropriated by state officials. And as we've seen, the Syrian government is no stranger to corruption. So passing foreign aid through government channels in Syria might be a very ineffective way of going about any sort of reconstruction efforts. Additionally, Syria faces extensive economic sanctions passed by Western powers such as the United States and the European Union, which additionally hamper their economic recovery. Now, from the perspective of the EU and the US, these sanctions are a crucial bargaining chip in their relations with the Assad government. Essentially, since there is no internal threat to the Assad government any longer, the only way to leverage any sort of change that would benefit the US or the EU out of his regime would be to leverage foreign aid in exchange for political favors, essentially. So the most realistic way of reconstructing Syria as it stands would be to try to disperse funding for it through channels that would circumnavigate the government. So essentially, there can really be no government interference in the reconstruction efforts in Syria if they are to be successful, at least under the current government. So that has been my presentation on the Syrian civil war. These are my sources, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Let's switch again to Image.
Yep.
And if you have any questions for him.
Peter, I would just like to say that was a lot, Syria is a lot of information to cover, and you definitely did that very well.
Thank you. Yes, it is a lot.
Yeah, I was going to ask you actually something a little bit similar. So since I've seen this project evolve, and I think you did a wonderful job, but what do you think was the most interesting thing you learned that you didn't know going into it?
I think that probably, so the thing that got me interested in this topic in the first place was actually the narco state angle of the Syrian government colluding with essentially Hezbollah drug lords in order to keep its economy alive in some ways. And that was my initial interest in this topic. I found that very interesting. And then as I started to investigate, well, it turns out that it's not as simple as that. You obviously have to cover a lot of context before you can get to why the Assad government would do such a thing. And it just sort of spiraled into a general analysis on the consequences of war on the economy. So, yeah.
I have a question. This kind of fragmentation for years and years of any representative power in Syria, do you think this would lead eventually to some kind of splintering of the country into different regions or not?
Well, that is essentially something that had happened during the civil war, although they still technically were a part of the Syrian state. If you look at a map, as I discussed, the Syrian government lost control of these territories. Now, at this point, they have regained a lot of what they had lost over the course of the war. And as things stand right now, I don't think that there are any internal factions that really have the capacity to retake any territory from the Syrian government at this point. But I think what is more interesting to me is the question of whether or not any of these people who lay down their arms in defeat in the face of the Syrian government, how will they ever reintegrate themselves into a sort of Syrian society and a Syrian national identity? I mean, I think that this will have an impact on Syrian society for generations to come, and it will really cause some serious internal divisions within the country.
Also, I have seen some comments comparing Syria with Beirut and Lebanon in 1983. So do you think that bears any resemblance with what happened in Beirut and in Lebanon 3 decades ago or 4?
I'm gonna be completely honest with you. I don't know what happened in Beirut and Lebanon in the 1980s. But if you could give me like a broad rundown, I could probably assess the similarity. I don't know.
Right. I have seen some articles recently talking about some parallels drawn with Beirut and what happened at the time. The same fragmentation of power, the same fragmentation of the population, arming themselves, allying themselves with different outside forces. So maintaining that kind of conflict that was destroying capital, Beirut, that was very fancy at the end of the 70s for the Middle East. But yeah.
Oh, so yeah, well, in that sense, I think that there are some similarities. This actually reminds me of, well, so what I would say is that I think it would be a bit different because Syria's economic decline did not start with the civil war. It's not like Syria was some sort of haven for in the Middle East before the war broke out. The economic situation there had already been on a downward trend for a long time, and that was just because of the self-serving legislation passed by the government and just very bad economic policy in general. And so in those terms, I don't know how if it would be comparable in that way, but perhaps in terms of the way that the country was divided, and that way it may be comparable. I'm not sure. I don't know the details.
I think in Beirut there were also some Christian factions fighting with the rest of the population. But in Syria, do you think the conflict is still kept on the religious lines between the Shiite and the Sunnis, or?
Yeah, so at this point, I do think that the conflict is not really what it was at the beginning. As I said, at this point, it seems pretty clear that the Syrian government is there to stay for good or bad. So I do think that at this point, it might have essentially just boiled down to the religious aspect of it, where that is the remaining conflict that is currently being fought. But in another way, I think that the Syrian civil war continues in terms of international geopolitics, because even though there's no internal threat to the Assad government, Western powers still do their utmost in terms of economic sanctions and foreign relations to try to either bend the Assad government to their will, or to just attempt to have it collapse, essentially. So in that way, I feel like the proxy war continues even though the civil war has ended.
Yeah. Anybody else with any questions for Peter? You can see that the guys always like the armed conflict and to be more informed and to discuss about it. Okay, so if there's no more questions, Peter, if you can get out of the screen sharing, because I can see you now in 2 different images.
Oh, sorry, I think I clicked stop share. Did it work, or is it still?
Well, not for me for the moment. I guess if we move to the next presenter, maybe it will switch to her computer. And it's about Ashley Brown, who will present crisis communication practices of international organizations. Ashley, if you're ready, try to take over the screen sharing. Good.
Okay. All right, so my name is Ashley Brown, and I will be talking about crisis communication practices of international organizations. My project examines the question if international organizations matter in times of global crisis. So the first method is to explain the 3 out of many trans-border crises that international organizations were called on to help with. So this would be the 2011 domestic revolt in Syria, the 2011 situation in Somalia, and the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank in trying to solve the ongoing European sovereign debt crisis. So first, we will be talking about the 2011 domestic revolt in Syria. So this started in the March of 2011, and it's still going on, fighting its longest war. The UNSC, the United Nations Security Council, has been heavily involved in this crisis from the start, as well as the European Union. The Security Council is the United Nations' most powerful body when it comes to maintaining international security and peace. The Council has the power to dispatch military operation, mandate arms inspections, and deploy election monitors. The United Nations, as well as the European Union, are important to note in the Syria crisis because they make up the world's most powerful international organizations. And it's also important to note that international organizations are not whatsoever more powerful than governments. The United Nations was not designed to stop every crisis or war, and that is not a primary responsibility of international organizations. The United Nations goals and pursuits, even throughout the Syrian conflict, has always stayed consistent. Their responses to crises include keeping peace throughout the world, developing friendly relations among nations, and collaborating with other nations to achieve improving individuals' lives in the different ways overall, improving their well-being. So the Syrian crisis is the largest displacement crisis in the world as society knows it. At first, when the crisis broke out in March of 2011, the Syrian government was censored by the international community because the Syrian government started to violate human rights, resulting in widespread violence. So furthermore, the international community responded by imposing sanctions on Syria, and this includes the United States, the European Union, Canada, Australia, Switzerland, and the Arab League. These countries have kept imposed sanctions in place ever since the present day. So the United Nations and the European Union can implement sanctions in crisis situations under specific measures. Not all international organizations can do this, but since the European Union, it works so closely with the government, they can do this. But the United Nations Security Council can impose sanctions in response to a threat of international peace, much like the Syria war. So the European Union has teamed up with the United Nations to provide humanitarian relief as a response to the civilians' needs as well. And the European Union, being one of the United Nations' biggest financial contributors, is known to abide by the United Nations and their response, especially in the Syria crisis. So the 2011 domestic revolt in Syria, this is the overall response from international organizations. So the United Nations Security General proposed that the situation going on in Syria needed to be referred to the ICC, which is the International Criminal Court. The situation was finally referred to the International Criminal Court, but it only failed because of negative votes. So the council has to agree on something, and nothing was agreed upon for measures to be taken to end the revolt in Syria. And this caused the crisis only to be prolonged, contributing to why the war has gone on for as long as it has. In fact, since the Syrian conflict started in March of 2011, China and Russia have vetoed a total of 16 drafts from the United Nations Security Council resolutions aimed at addressing the Syrian crisis and ending the conflict. So this is how a peaceful uprising kind of resulted in a full-scale civil war. The United Nations and other international organizations players were trying to communicate and come up with a clear decision on what to do. But meanwhile, countless children's lives were being destroyed, civilians' homes were being destroyed by the minute. So in 2013, the United Nations Security General for Humanitarian Affairs, Valerie Amos, and the High Commissioner for Human Rights, Navi Pillay, they stressed that there has been continuing indiscriminate violence in Syria and is only worsening for human rights and humanitarian situations faced by civilians. Present day, 2022, the crisis is still ongoing with no sure signs of stopping it or being solved yet. Conditions have only worsened, with the United Nations struggling to produce the money needed to provide humanitarian relief. After 10 years of crisis, there has been 13.4 million people in need of humanitarian relief and protection assistance, and 6.7 million displaced people and 6.6 million Syrian refugees worldwide, with 5.6 million refugees staying in countries nearby. And then the COVID-19 pandemic only worsened conditions and has made this crisis even worse. So the second crisis I will be talking about is the 2011 famine in Somalia. So Somalia is located in Africa, in the easternmost part, often referred to as the Horn of Africa. The World Bank, which is a part of the United Nations, the European Union, and the United Nations were a part of this response. The United Nations responded to the famine in Africa officially in 2011 after 11 months of warnings from Somalia. This drought is what caused the famine crisis in which more than 1 million people faced, and they are still facing this today in 2022. So 2011 was not the first time Somalia experienced something like this. Somalia has had a long time of problems related to this and governmental corruption as well. The United Nations ignored the warning signs from Somalia for so long because, according to an article released from the United Nations Secretary General, they resisted trying to use famine, but eventually realized the reality that could not be ignored anymore. Ban Ki-moon, which is the Secretary General for the United Nations and the press release reporter for the United Nations, received daily reports from the United Nations teams in Somalia, hearing gruesome reports. Children, livestock, such as cattle, and other individuals who considered themselves well off were dying from thirst. Other individuals walked for weeks trying to find help in Ethiopia and Kenya. Many did not make it through the journey. There hasn't been rain during that 2011 timeframe for 4 years. So for famine to occur, there needs to be 3 different factors taking place, such as failure of food production, an inability to access food, and a failure of governments and international donors to respond. So Somalia has been battling a civil war that originally started in 1991, but that already affected much of the country's resources and infrastructure. The United Nations has been engaging in peacekeeping and humanitarian efforts since the early 1990s. The United Nations originally had 2 missions back in the 1990s called the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia, the short for UNSAM, 1 and 2, but they both resulted in failed efforts. So meanwhile, more response from the international community. We have the World Bank's response to Somalia. They've been promoting good governance while helping Somalia recover economically and create jobs after the loss of destruction. And the European Union is one of Somalia's biggest donors as well. The United Nations was instrumental in providing relief to citizens to Somalia with basic necessities to survive and shelter. And then in 2011, the United Nations stated that they needed approximately $1.6 billion in aid. So international organizations, along with other donors, only gave them half that amount to relieve suffering. This situation in Somalia is just so difficult because there are ongoing problems that complicate any relief effort. It is called for the international community to come in and help with any relief efforts they possibly can. And meanwhile, as this situation continued, there was also the problem of rising food prices. So the rising food prices complicated and stretched the budgets of international agencies and NGOs. Ban Ki-moon made it apparent in the United Nations press release that the United Nations needed to make a plan to deal with the underlying factors of the crisis. So it's apparent that the 2011 drought was the worst in decades because of the increasing effects of climate change around the world. So the United Nations took action and made a plan to implement practical agriculture measures such as livestock programs, irrigation, rural infrastructure, and drought-resistant seeds. This contingency plan has been working. It's been proven to work because the United Nations implemented it in Ethiopia to boost agriculture production, and it showed great results. So over the last 10 years, these projects showed 8% of an increase in production. So this practice was really effective. And then, of course, the United Nations made sure their voice was heard on the humanitarian diplomatic approach to the situation as well. And they preached in their press releases that something needs to happen in Somalia and nothing is getting better. So furthermore, there were also existing threats present in Somalia that complicated operating conditions to provide relief. So the transitional national government only controls and operates part of Somalia, which compromises the United Nations efforts in Somalia. So in 2011, the United Nations tried to reach an agreement with the forces of Al-Shabaab. They are an Islamic militia group. So a few years prior to the declared famine in Somalia, Al-Shabaab was held responsible for the killing of several foreign aid peace workers, as well as vandalizing several United Nations compounds in Somalia. Additionally, Al-Shabaab is held responsible for the killings of hundreds of people, obstructing humanitarian efforts that the United Nations and other international organizations are trying to make. And Al-Shabaab has risen against the Somalia transitional government as well, making known that they are a threat to the people and other members that try to intervene. The United Nations has tried to make peace with Al-Shabaab, but they are a very dangerous terrorist group. They're not limited to bombing, suicide attacks, armed assaults, civilian casualties, making it more dangerous for the international community to intervene and provide assistance. So the last transitional crisis I'm going to talk about is the European Union, the International Monetary Fund, and the European Central Bank in their response to the European sovereign debt crisis. So the EU, the IMF, and the ECB, they were all very essential international organizations during the debt crisis. During the European sovereign debt crisis, Iceland's banking system was the first to experience a crisis in 2008, and that is what officially began the debt crisis. Other contributing causes included the 2008 to 2012 Great Recession, as well as Iceland's banking collapse, leading to Greece, Ireland, Portugal, Italy, a total collapse and lack of trust in the European banking system and economy. Here is a timeline of just when the financial debt crisis was, when the world economic crisis was, because this went on during a time where just the global debt crisis, it was just everywhere. And additionally, other factors contributed to the financial crisis, such as a market crisis in real estate and property bubbles happening in several countries at the time. The Eurozone member states, including Spain, Greece, and Portugal and Ireland, and many others, they were under a tremendous load of debt, and they were unable to pay back what they owed at the time without an assistance of a third-party financial institution for bailout. Greece had also admitted that they underreported their budget, and this violated European Union policy. So eventually, all of these different factors is what caused the European Central Bank and the IMF to get involved. So the IMF and the ECB, these were just the two international organizations that really played a role in rebuilding the structure of everything. The IMF is an international organization located in Washington, D.C. They're made up of 189 member states that specialize in global economic developments. They identify risk in finance as well as other areas of growth. And the European debt crisis revealed the unreliability and cracks in the European Union framework in which they do banking. The IMF had the skills and knowledge for this particular situation to rebuild the structure and make a positive difference. So the IMF's plan. So in fact, the IMF created a contingency plan to address initiatives on how to solve the global financial crisis many countries were facing. So the IMF's goal was to create a sharp level of increase in concessional lending to low-income countries, which has not happened in a very long time historically. And they also did an increase in how much the IMF lends to low-income countries. So overall, the IMF budgeted commitments to low-income countries at $2.7 billion compared to their previous budget, which was $1.1 billion for the entire year of 2008. not only did the IMF plan to do this, but they created additional initiatives to how they were going to solve the global financial crisis. So the additional steps to solve the crisis, this included relief on all interest payments for low-income countries between 2009 and 2011, and new resources for low-income countries through new lending instruments they created. So the IMF developed new financial instruments that would be flexible and catered to the increasing diversity of low-income countries. The three new financial instruments include the Standby Credit Facility, the Extended Credit Facility, and the Rapid Credit Facility. So these fancy new programs helped out low-income countries, and they were developed under a bigger program called the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. So the Extended Credit Facility, this specifically provided flexible medium support to low-income countries, along with the Standby Credit Facility that addressed short-term and precautionary needs, as well as the Rapid Credit Facility that offered emergency support with limited conditionality. So the result of these measures has successfully transformed how the IMF handles relations with low-income countries. All right, so we're coming from the crises, and now we're talking about crisis communication theory. So the pre-crisis phase, this is the first essential step in prevention of leading to a crisis. So in order for prevention to happen, they need to include 4 different parts that can go into creating a crisis management plan. Organizations are better at handling crises when they have these 4 things implemented. So this includes having a crisis management plan, of course. This needs to be updated at least annually. Having a properly trained crisis management team. You need to test the crisis management plan and team at least annually. And having the PR material, such as the pre-draft crisis management materials and messages for the legal department to review. So to break down what factors are important in the pre-crisis phase, this includes the crisis management plan, the crisis management team, spokesperson, pre-draft messages, and communication channels in that order. So the crisis response is the initial response for how to respond to a crisis when it happens. There are 2 sections dividing up the crisis response, including the initial crisis response and reputation repair and behavioral intentions. So the post-crisis phase is the last piece of communication in the crisis phase. The crisis has passed. It no longer requires the amount of attention that it once did. But however, there are still practices and tools in place to minimize the overall damage risk. So this includes delivering all of the obtained information to stakeholders as soon as possible. You need to be keeping communication going with the stakeholders, and any corrections or advances from the crisis need to be reported. And to reflect and analyze the crisis management efforts for lessons, and to learn from those lessons, taking newfound knowledge back to the management team. It's just very important to note again that no organization is safe from crisis, which is why crisis communication and prevention is important in any organization, and in this situation, international organizations. So my findings and analysis. So communication done effectively and conducted in a timely manner informs people about hazards to their environment or their health, manages potential problems in a manner that promotes goodwill, disseminates information, and communicates potential crisis and emergency situations well. Encouraging prudent action and reducing panic. So if any organizations fail to communicate in a timely and effective manner, that leaves time for other organizations to respond and for a crisis to further develop. So furthermore, these are my findings and analysis. The 2011 Somalia famine could have been mitigated, but the United Nations ignored the warning signs from Somalia for so long, and things only got worse and allowed for the crisis to further develop in organizations around the world to negatively speak on the United Nations, actions and intentions because no one knew what their intentions really were. During the Syria crisis, the United Nations responded in time to the human rights in Syria being violated and referring it to the ICC, which was great. But however, because of their international players, such as China and Russia, they vetoed the draft 16 times. The UN proposed that they were not able to come to a clear decision, external factors making it difficult. The IMF and the European Central Bank, I think these were two great examples of how international organizations that communicated effectively. They informed people about hazards to their environment or to their health. They managed potential problems in a manner that promotes goodwill, disseminated information, and they communicated potential crisis and emergency situations well. They encouraged prudent action and they reduced panic. However, there always could be more room for improvement. Solutions. So every international crisis organization, they will encounter a crisis. It's nothing to freak out about, but there's not always going to be a one size fits all solution here. But here are things they can better implement and they can learn from to respond better to a crisis. So anticipate all crises and immediately respond as soon as possible. Communicate to all parties involved as soon as you know something and the situation develops. Also, be willing to adjust your communication and to implement the right plan, and to constantly update and adapt crisis communication networks and practices. And here's a quote that I thought was very fitting for this research. A crisis is not necessarily a disaster when handled in a timely and effective way. A crisis can actually become an opportunity to gain competitive advantage, to build trust and confidence and move the organization forward. It's by Katie Garcia, which is also works for the United Nations. And that is my reference page.
Okay, let's open it for questions. Oh, Berta has her hand up.
Oh, it was the clapping reaction. I just wanted to tell Ashley she did a good job. That was very informative.
Oh,
Thanks,
yes.
Berta.
Yes. Yes, she did a thorough job. She worked a lot for this. Anybody? Questions? Because I have some. Oh, okay, Peter has his hand up.
Yeah, I also just wanted to. I didn't realize leading up to this that your project also had a whole portion on Syria as well. Well,
Yeah.
but you did really good. I'm jealous. I wish I could have done it that well. But so I'm sorry. Can you just either reiterate or go into more detail of like what do you think would have been the best way to respond to the Syrian civil war in terms of like from the perspective of like the US and the EU? What do you think that sanctions were like a fitting punishment for the crimes committed by the government, or do you think that ultimately they only end up hurting like the people, or like?
I think it's definitely like a double-edged sword. What I thought could have been better from the United Nations doing is definitely like not wait years for Russia and China to veto that from the International Criminal Court. I think they probably should have done more of a humanitarian approach with what they could, because a lot of things were going down in Syria. But I think the sanctions were, you know, all they could do in that situation. But like I said, just better practices. And, you know, if something's not going to work 16 times or even after 4 times, you know, you got to find a better way to do something.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Well, I was thinking about, you know, for Somalia, You mentioned at a certain moment that there were some initiatives, some programs by UN, and number one and number two, and they failed. So one of the rules of crisis analysis is if response to crisis was well organized, at least they should have learned from their mistakes and they should have improved. But there's here is program one, program two, both fail. So either there was lack of will, lack of resources. And you see, for example, if you were to draw parallels of the crisis situation with Ukraine, there's a lot of criticism from, especially from Middle Eastern and North African countries, for the unparalleled response from the European Union and from the United States. You know, these packages of aid that keep on coming, $20 billion. I don't know how many $billion. I was comparing with the 1.3 or 1.5 that you're mentioning as an aid that was necessary for keeping Somalia floating, you know, and that was not found anywhere. So there were so many people dying over there of thirst and hunger and so on and so forth. So I was wondering, is there, from what you read, any kind of explanation? Otherwise, you know, it turns you to thinking something dark or gruesome, that somebody wants to, you know, let those people die.
Yeah. And from literature reviews I've been reading, heavily very critiquing what happened in Somalia. Basically, the United Nations sitting that money over, but there's so much governmental corruption that the government would just use that money to do what they wish, and that it's very sad. But governmental corruption, you know, as we see in Syria, it can run that deep sometimes.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. If the local government does not cooperate for the benefit of their own population, then it's very hard from external aid to be placed where it's mostly needed.
Yeah, it really is.
That is true. Any other questions for Ashley? Well, then, thank you very much, Ashley. Let's switch to Blerta, and she will talk to us about creating sustainable communities guidebook.
Okay, hi everyone. So as mentioned, this is my PowerPoint of creating sustainable communities. And a quote here by Jeff Bridges is, "The way to change the world is through individual responsibility and taking local action in your own communities." And so for reference or just a table of contents, what I'll be talking about is introduction and background, a little bit about myself, defining sustainability, the SIUE Successful Communities Collaborative Initiative and its current project with Venice, Madison, and Brooklyn, about the United Nations and the UNDP Sustainable Development Goals, how the United Nations Development Goals apply to the SSCC project, the EPIC Model Sustainable Development Goals 360 Thinking from Classroom to Community, and then the next portion is implementation, objectives, methods, results, and then conclusion. So regarding introduction and background, a little bit about myself. I am graduating this semester, this Saturday, from SIUE with a bachelor's in international studies with a specialization in sustainability and development, as well as a double minor in business administration in Spanish. In this semester, I had the honor of working as an IRCA assistant for Dr. Connie Fry-Spurlock. And as an IRCA assistant, I worked with SIUE Successful Community Collaborative Team to represent Western Illinois, SIUC, SIUE, the Leadership Council of Madison County, as well as Venice, Madison, and Brooklyn, Illinois residents on a community development project. So our focus has been on the development of a new grocery store in Venice, as well as promoting community involvement and local knowledge on the overall development project. And so I was able to use the data and experiences I had through IRCA on my senior assignment, which is why I was able to do an application project. So defining sustainability, it's a broad policy and ethical concept at the global, national, and individual consumer level. It is often considered to have 3 dimensions: environmental, economic, and social. In 1987, the United Nations Brundtland Commission defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Sustainable development requires an integrated approach that takes into consideration environmental concerns along with economic development. So a little rundown of the SIUE's Successful Communities Collaborative Initiative. It's a cross-disciplinary program that supports partnerships between the university and communities in Illinois to advance local resilience and sustainability based on community-identified environmental, social, and economic issues and needs. Our mission is to connect communities with students and faculty of SIUE. For communities, the SSCC provides initiative or innovative strategies to move community-identified high-priority sustainability goals forward. Communities often face limited resources to explore sustainability and quality of life questions. So the SSCC seeks to reduce these obstacles by linking existing graduate and undergraduate courses at SIUE to explore innovative solutions to community-identified projects. Oftentimes, the SSCC selects a single partner community, generally a city or a county, through a competitive application process. And working with administrative staff and stakeholders in the selected community, the collaborative helps identify 10 to 15 projects that will advance local resilience and sustainability based on community identified needs. So each project is connected with one or more courses at SIUE that can provide research or technical support to move the project forward. So working with Madison, Brooklyn, and Venice, Illinois, which I have pulled up on this map. They're located north of East St. Louis along the Mississippi River. The research done mobilizes interdisciplinary efforts to develop multi-dimensional strategies for sustainable and resilient redevelopment within Venice, Madison, and Brooklyn. So focusing on the grocery store, the nearest grocery store is located approximately 4 miles away from the 3 towns, which requires a 10 to 15 minute car ride or a 25 to 50 minute bus ride. And a majority of households do not have vehicles in these towns, creating quite a food desert and then also an obstacle to go grocery shopping. A majority of the stores in these locations are either liquor stores or convenience stores, which don't provide fresh foods. And the concerns for socioeconomic and environmental are inseparable. And this work that we're doing presents approaches towards urban and community development and their strategic interfaces with natural systems to mutual benefit. So while we've been we are currently in phase 1, and this is the pre-planning phase for the grocery store and other developments within the 3 cities. We've been working to understand the communities better because localized knowledge integration is necessary to understand a community's basic prerequisites and affordances offered within the regional capacities. And so jumping from the Venice, Brooklyn, Madison project through the SSCC and talking about the United Nations. And later on, I'll be able to tie why I'm bringing up both of these. But a little bit about the United Nations. It is an international organization founded in 1945. The UN's membership has grown from the original 51 member states in 1945 to the current 193 member states. The UN and its work are guided by the purposes and principles contained in its founding charter, which are peace, justice, respect, human rights, tolerance, and solidarity. The UN has evolved over the years to keep pace with the rapidly changing world. But one thing has stayed the same. It remains the one place on earth where all the world's nations can gather together, discuss common problems, and find shared solutions that benefit all of humanity. And jumping from the United Nations to the United Nations Development Program, which is a lead agency on international development. The UNDP works in 170 countries and territories to eradicate poverty and achieve sustainable economic growth and human development. They help countries to develop policies, leadership skills, partnering abilities, institutional capabilities, and build resilience to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Their work is concentrated in 3 focus areas: sustainable development, democratic governance and peace building, and climate and disaster resilience. So right now, just giving basic information on each of these organizations. I'll be tying in together how these are connected. But jumping into the UNDP Sustainable Development Goals, we have 1, no poverty; 2, zero hunger; 3, health and well-being; 4, quality education; 5, gender equality; 6, clean water and sanitation; 7, affordable and clean energy; 8, decent work and economic growth; 9, industry, innovation and infrastructure; 10, reduced inequalities; 11, sustainable cities and communities; 12, responsible consumption and production; 13, climate action; 14, life below water; 15, life on land; 16, peace, justice, and strong institutions; and 17, partnerships for the goals. So the Sustainable Development Goals are also known as the Global Goals. They were adopted by the United Nations in 2015 as a universal call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that by 2030, all people enjoy peace and prosperity. The 17 SDGs are integrated. They recognize that an action in one area will affect outcomes in others, and that development must balance a social, economic, and environmental sustainability. Countries have committed to prioritize progress for those who are further behind. And these are applicable also to areas within the United States or developed countries that are lacking resources or don't have the same opportunities as other cities within those developed countries. So kind of tying it together in how the United Nations Development Program, Sustainable Development Goals applies to the SSC project. The SSC initiative embodies the United Nations Development Program's Sustainable Development Goals because the work promotes interdisciplinary efforts to develop working strategies for community revitalization, economic growth, and environmentally resilient development. The SCC aims to bridge discourses and to offer insights and resources for equitable development with connections to distinct socioeconomic or socio-environmental frameworks with the greater domains of mainstream global approaches to transformative challenges. So kind of going back to the quote I mentioned earlier in the slides, the way to make these lasting changes with these global perspectives, because as an international studies major, that's what we're focusing on is the global perspective. We're able to implement that perspective and that initiative with either with local projects, which is exactly what the SSC is doing. So talking about the EPIC model, Sustainable Development Goals, the EPIC model is a nonprofit that basically connects universities with local towns. And that's essentially what the SIUE Successful Community Collaborative is doing. So they're connecting the university's resources with Venice, Brooklyn, and Madison in this case. And it's showing here how each goal is interconnected. So in the picture, you can see that we have sustainable cities and communities and how several goals within this one goal are impacted by it. It's simple but powerful, so it brings together the greatest resources in academia. You have professors, students, laboratories, research libraries, existing curriculum. You have programs or classes that will then work on projects within this. And then following implementation, the objectives. Our objective as an SSCC team and as an IRCA assistant myself was to strengthen community relationships with Venice, Brooklyn, Madison residents, political leaders, and other interested parties, implement sustainable practices within the community infrastructure, assist with outreach and marketing to engage local citizens as well as university students and members, and offer the allocation of resources. So our methods were visiting on-site locations, such as towns, community centers, as well as working closely with political and religious leaders. We could better collaborate with community members to ensure that our actions match their ideas. By interviewing community members and interested stakeholders, we learned about Venice, Brooklyn, and Madison, not only through qualitative data collection, but also quantitative data collection, but also qualitative information. By involving various departments at SIUE and SIUC, we can collaborate with community members to develop plans to provide resources and other services to the community. So for example, next semester, classes such as are the history department, anthropology department, engineering, construction, they will all be working with the village of Brooklyn in order to create a museum in their community center, and then also just help them with the infrastructure of their roof and wall for some of the local churches. So another example that ties into the SDG, so like Sustainable Development Goals, as well as the SIUE Successful Community Collaborative, is the 12 approaches to neighborhood development. So Lipton Center has created this framework of common community development approaches that corresponds to the SIUE Successful Collaborative Center's approach to the Venice, Brooklyn, and Madison initiative. They break the 12 approaches into 3 categories. There's social fabric, structural and systemic, and economics. So within social fabric, we're creating a sense of place. And by going to these communities and being on the floor, speaking to the community members, we're able to develop and support credible leadership, showing them that we are hands-on, and the approach that we're taking is more collaborative rather than going and telling the community this is what's going to happen. So fostering neighborhood connectivity, also, by meeting political leaders, concerned community members, and religious leaders, we're able to connect with them. Same thing with connecting with the faith community. By establishing relationships with them, we're able to build trust, because oftentimes communities such as Venice, Brooklyn, and Madison, and a lot of communities that the SDG goals are implemented to, have a distrust for our institutions and for our organizations. And so moving on to the structural environment, is tackling the physical environment, which by providing resources for like improving the infrastructure in the buildings, we're able to tackle the physical environment, safety and security. So by improving the infrastructure, by creating safe places for people to gather, and implementing these steps, we're creating safety and security through education. So SSCC is giving like a lifelong learners initiative. So essentially teaching people in the community how to do certain things, and then working with the schools within these areas to further educate children and adults. And then health and social services by teaming up with the nursing program and other departments at SIUE. We're planning to give like free health clinic checkups, more information regarding health, and how to eat healthier, which then ties back to that grocery store initiative of providing the fresh foods to the community. And then economics. So another project for the SSCC is affordable housing. That's one of the several projects that they are still planning. And these affordable housing will be located near the grocery store, which will then create employment for people in the community. Increasing the household income naturally, and creating local commerce. Another initiative that we've had with this grocery store is to have spaces that people can rent out instead of putting tenants in, such as like corporate companies. It would be like small business owners, local business owners, giving people the opportunity to not only start their own businesses and entrepreneurship, but also offering jobs to people who would like to work there. And so with the results, transparency through communication about university community past and current relationships has been very big in this overall project. So this semester, the people we have interviewed from the communities, either current members or people who used to live there and no longer do, have been honest with us about their distrust for universities or predominantly white institutions, and what their thought process is as we collaborate with their political leaders in order to get these projects going. Keeping it transparent, letting community members decide what happens and when has been a result of this, to kind of better the trust between the two. And then that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals have aligned with the SIUE Successful Community Collaborative Initiative. So all the goals that I mentioned earlier are interconnected and play into the SSCC's initiative because of their focus on the sustainability aspect and the economic, environmental implications as well. And for my conclusion, the Creating Sustainable Communities Guidebook has guided us through SIUE's Successful Communities Collaborative Initiative, some history of Venice, Brooklyn, and Madison, and the SSCC project description. We also discussed the United Nations Development Goals, how they apply to the SSC project, and how the Sustainable Development Goals 360 thinking from classroom to community allows university community partnerships to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Through the implementation of sustainable and equitable practices within the community infrastructure, assistance with outreach and marketing, and offering the allocation of resources, the SSCC has strengthened its relationships with Venice, Madison, and Brooklyn, political leaders, and community members by approaching the initiative through a restorative framework. So that's where that transparency comes in, was a result of just open communication and then listening to the needs of the community members before implementing any steps. The SSCC has identified how the university can better address community needs by planning community-led engagement community forums, grant proposals, and creating volunteer opportunities for SIUE faculty and students, as well as community members. And that is my works cited. Thank you for listening. If you guys have any questions, I'll try my best to answer them.
Nancy has a question.
I actually have two questions. So number one, I love this project because I feel like I've seen this grow ever since INTS 200, where we were first sort of starting to think about how you would do stuff. So the two questions, the first one is, I like the way you integrated the UN Sustainability Development Goals with the SSCC. Was that ever part of the original SSCC planning, or is that something you just sort of saw a similarity in?
So initially I saw a similarity, and as I started working with Dr. Frispurlock, she added me onto this like email of a larger presentation that they're having later in the year, I think sometime in September. And with this presentation, the way they were talking about the SSCC and its initiative correlated to the United Nations Development Program's sustainable goals. So when I first started the project, I didn't know that they initially intentionally made that connection. I just noticed it myself. And later on working with them, I realized that that was kind of their intention with it.
Okay, so my second question is, so that makes sense, because I was wondering if that had been built in or it was just happening to be coincidence. So my second question is, since your little bio says you would like a job with the UNDP, pretend you're in an interview with the UNDP, what would you say was the biggest takeaway experience you took from the semester working as an IRCAN assistant with this project?
That government work is slow. I think I didn't realize how many layers there was to it. You know, looking at it from the outside, you think, oh, it's simple. You just do this, this, and this. And then with each step, there's so many different things you need to implement and consider, whether it's communicating with others, making sure that the information you're getting is accurate, you know, like the grants being written, because a lot of this does need to be financed, and the money needs to come from somewhere. So it's just, it's a longer process than I realized it is, and it's a lot more particular. So I think for me, one thing I would mention is I commend political leaders, actually, and people who work in the government, because it's not an easy task. It's a lot easier to sit here and critique and say what you could do and what you could not do until you actually try to do it yourself.
Okay, anybody else?
I also have a question. So I was just thinking about, you know, the community work you've been doing with like Venice and Madison. And I was thinking it would be so beneficial if they could do something like with East St. Louis, like rebuild that trust and transparency. I didn't know if you knew, or even Dr. Nastasia, if there's any IRCA projects with like that East St. Louis connection and rebuilding that.
Mm-hmm. There is. I don't know the exact name of the project, but Dr. Fry-Spurlock is also in charge of that. I think it's something with racial healing. I can't remember the exact name, but
it's called the TRHT, Truth, Racial Healing, and something.
Oh,
yes.
Interesting.
Yeah, so she's also in charge of that program, and they're working specifically with East St. Louis.
Very
Yes.
cool.
Actually, I wanted to add this, that I collaborated many times with Dr. Fry-Spurlock in the past 4 or 5 years in my other capacity as professor in the Department of Applied Communication Studies on the track of public relations. So for the capstone experience in public relations for 2 semesters in the last year, the students in public relations track do these campaigns culminating with events. Mm-hmm. To help different communities. And, you know, most of the times I'm not interested in collaborating with for-profit organizations, but with not for-profit organizations or communities or departments of SIE. So many times either we collaborated with SSCC or with TRHT in the past 2 years. It looks to me that it's in the same system, like they're trying to do now with SSCC, to leave the local communities with some lessons learned in the form of something written, like a blueprint. We do a proposal in December, and we do a report in April, May, for the client organization to, if they, you know, they go with us through an experience of building something. And by the way, we had this experience with the East St. Louis. Usually in such communities that have economic hardships, you have to map the assets. What are they proud of? Maybe even in a distant past, and, you know, former glory, because East St. Louis, for example, definitely had that as an economic powerhouse in the end of the 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. With slaughterhouses and so on and so forth. So much wealth was going through that place. But now they are in a very difficult economic situation. And there's many people who remember with fond regards the place where they were children and they studied and they grew up. But they are trying maybe to help now, and this is what TRHT is doing, is they are recording, and my students also made a documentary this semester with recording e-stories, recordings either in writing or recordings with video and voice of people who want to tell something that they were proud of while they were in East St. Louis, for example. And it starts from there. You have to show to the new generations that there is something to believe in, so they can still, collaborate with any means to sustaining those communities. But
Yeah,
I
thank
had,
you for that elaboration. That's very, interesting to see. And good job, Loretta.
yes.
Thank you.
Okay, I will have another question, but somebody's ringing at the door. Just a moment.
Very good job.
Thank you.
So what comes next? I don't remember when your bio, what the next step was. What happens after you graduate?
So I applied to this program. It's called the National American Language and Cultures Program. So I would be teaching English in Spain somewhere. I applied to that, and I have yet to receive my location. So if I receive a location and I'm accepted, that's what I will be doing in September. Otherwise, my family is going to North Macedonia this summer. So when I come back from my trip, I will probably look for jobs somewhere in Chicago.
Well, send my regards to Alexander, right?
Will do.
Okay, I had another question, and this is more like a little provocation here, because you see, I wrote down when you were showing the Sustainable Development Goals that were adopted by UN in 2015, it starts with 1, no poverty, 2, no hunger, 11, sustainable cities and communities, that coalesces all these goals and trying to bring them to a common denominator. But can you give me an example of any country around the world that has no poverty, no hunger, and even the United States, even Japan, even, I don't know, big countries?
Yeah, I agree. There is no country that has none of these. So I mentioned earlier that the Sustainable Development Goals was made more so for those developing countries, but even in developed countries like the United States, you have communities like Brooklyn, Madison, and Venice that don't have the same opportunities or resources as other cities, like for example, Edwardsville do. So it's just taking these goals and the intention of trying to reduce that as much as possible, because to eliminate it completely is very unrealistic and probably not probable with the time limit that they have and also the resources that we have at the moment.
Plus, I wanted to ask you, because that's what I observed in the past few years when I was collaborating with the TRHT and SSCC. Who are those people? Because there's usually a nucleus in every one of these communities that really cares about their community. Most of the times it's people who are close or into their retirement, and they come back to the communities from where they were because they are outside of big cities, and they try to start initiatives, either a farmer's market or an event that is annual and brings a lot of people into their community, and then brings revenue and so on and so forth. And then they start having these little initiatives. Let's have a baking contest. Let's have this festival. Let's have a festival reminding the people of our mining past, and when there were our heydays, and so on and so forth. What was your experience? Did you see that there were groups of people that were more dedicated to the final goals?
So it was very interesting because the people we interviewed who were natives to Brooklyn, Madison, or Venice, it was a broad, it was a variety of ages. So it wasn't any set age group. The political leaders, they, were heavily involved, and they are older. However, there were also some younger people who either no longer live in Brooklyn, Madison, or Venice. They're either living somewhere in the Missouri side of St. Louis due to economic opportunities, or people who had moved to like Texas for their own reasons that were still involved because it's such a tight-knit community. So one of the members that I had interviewed, he's a gentleman in his 30s. He talked about how growing up, everyone knew everyone going to school, and their families knew each other too. So this sense of community that they have, and then their involvement in the church. So religious practices are very big in these three communities, is what ties them together. And so regardless of where they're living, whether it is within the community, nearby in Missouri, or across the state, like across the country, they were heavily involved regardless of their age. And I think it goes back to that sense of pride of like where you come from that you mentioned, whether it's a historical aspect, cultural, linguistic. In this case, it is historical. So for example, with Brooklyn, it was the first incorporated Black town of America. And so the woman who discovered the town, she was a runaway slave, and she created this area to guide other slaves coming up to the north to freedom, or former slaves. And so in that sense, a lot of people, their families come from that time, and generationally they've been there, whether they're currently living in Brooklyn or somewhere else. And Brooklyn is an example because it has the strongest historical aspect. But there's a sense of pride to that. And so, for example, we worked with the Brooklyn Historical Society, and they were a big help throughout the process of wanting to educate people on what the town did, and what it's going to do, like its story itself. And the members there were mostly retired, but there were still like a good mix of some younger students, some working. It was a good like variety.
Right. As I was discussing with you and your, co-author of that poster, the poster presentations a few days ago, I think together with this kind of research, quantitative and qualitative that you were doing, I think maybe a longitudinal research would be appropriate to see for such communities in the past, maybe 25 years, and definitely since the beginning of the 21st century. What were the factors that made, provoked this flight of their population? Because that's usually the problem of small communities. Younger people not believing in their future over there where they were born and where they were educated because of lack of resources. Then they think about going to bigger cities. So there is flight of intelligent people and people with qualifications. And then of course that brings later on an economic problem, because, then the whole negative process that feeds itself, not enough revenue, not enough taxes paid, not enough development of the community,
Yes.
So then they have to know how you were mentioning, how to apply to certain external funding in a certain way, and then you really keep on doing it to develop smartly their communities. Okay, any other questions for Blerta? Peter wants to ask something.
Yeah. So I just wanted to, I know that at the very beginning of the presentation, you were talking about how essentially the perspective you're taking going into this project is that the way to change society broadly is to start on a local level and do what you can in your own community. But also, it strikes me that there definitely, and I'm not sure that obviously the specific area that you're talking about is like this, but there are definitely places that it's just not feasible to sort of I don't know, start sort of like give this jump start to revitalizing a community through starting local businesses, just because of the economic circumstances of the location where it is in. For example, if like tax laws are too hard on like small businesses, for example, and they're just too punishing for entrepreneurs who are just starting off. Are there ways in which sometimes maybe a more top-down approach is necessary in order to make projects like this able to be successful, like on a bigger scale and not just as one-off sort of instances?
Yeah, definitely. So I I believe that, government cooperation is very important. And so if there are places like that where, taxes are very heavy or unfair to starting off entrepreneurs, it would be very important for the government or urban planners to then implement some kind of like law or some kind of ruling to kind of assist them in that sense. And that is different with every place you go to. So it's a matter of cooperation, because you're right, it is challenging to start from the bottom up in that sense if you are not being cooperated with.
Okay. Well, if there are no more questions, I think we are a little bit late, 3:05, but it's a good late because we had a productive discussion here. And I very much enjoyed your presentations. It looks like, I'm so happy that our students can do such thorough research. And it seems to me that you are developing something that can be a hope for the future, either practically for finding jobs or for continuing with more education. So that gives me hope for the International Studies program at SIUE. Thank you very much for your time. As I said, I will save this and post it on my YouTube channel, and then post the link on our Facebook page. So if you haven't ever followed the SIUE INTS account on Facebook, do it now. Okay, have a nice day. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you.
Good job, everybody.